So many of us feel like we don't have any power, and it's just not true. Like, we have this beautiful core creative battery with like unlimited power, and it's just helping people tap back in and coming home to that. Like, you have it in you already. It's not out here somewhere. So let's just like slow down, tap into that in the context of safe community.
Hello, and welcome to The Art of Lost and Found, a podcast all about the process of creative recovery. From those low lows to the high highs, this podcast explores what it means to be a truly creative person and how creativity is a superpower that we all have that we can use for our own well-being and transformation. I'm your host, Brooke Eston. Our guest today is Molly Elizabeth, a professional artist, imagination doula, and the founder of the Darling Revolution. She helps creatives come home to themselves so they can imagine and birth a better world. As a creative professional, Molly has a daily studio practice where she makes mesmerizing, abstract, expressionist art. She works primarily with acrylic paints, blacklight reflective pigments, collage, or really any other material she can get her hands on. She also hosts a creativity-focused podcast, also called The Darling Revolution, where she dives into creativity, emotional literacy, and finding your voice. She believes that too often we are conditioned to stay quiet, stay small, not make too much of a fuss, and stop trusting our desires and imagination. If we can have a safe space to come home to these parts of ourselves, then Molly believes we can find the inner power to source what we need to revolutionize our world. But Molly wasn't always the colorful, provocative, outspoken creative doula she is today. She grew up within a very conservative, evangelical family and community, where she married young, had children, and eventually rose all the way to becoming a worship leader within her own evangelical church community. Then she experienced a deep loss that shook her faith in everything she had known. She began to question her faith, and the deeper she got, the more disconnected she became from everything that she had known. On the podcast today, she shares her story, how she had to lose everything in order to discover her truest self, and how she uses her creative practices and communities to maintain that connection with herself and those around her. Our conversation was so rich and so inspiring, and I'm just thrilled to be able to bring it to you. Without further ado, here's Molly. Welcome to the Art of Lost and Found podcast, Molly. I'm so pleased you're here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to chat.
Yay. So I wanted to give a little bit of context as to why I asked you on this podcast. You and I met very recently through the 100-Day Project, which for people who aren't familiar, it's a very simple open-ended project where for 100 days you focus on creating something. And it evolves, it changes, your demons and critics come out, your inner artist and inner child comes out. It's a full mixed bag experience around supporting artistry. Yeah. And you and I are fortunate enough to have been able to join El Luna's group, where she offered 100 days of coaching for $100, where every day she just opens her Zoom for a half an hour and hosts us to have sometimes a discussion, sometimes sharing, sometimes just silent co-working time. But it's been a really rich environment where all of the participants have been showing up in a vulnerable, open way. And when I first saw you on the little Zoom tile, I was drawn to you. I don't know if that was just the energy, or for people who haven't seen you, you have hot pink hair, you have bright colors, big earrings, like there's a lot going on visually in your square.
There is.
Um, but what really struck me about you wasn't just the physical sort of being drawn to you, but every day you would open the space by saying good morning to everybody, and you would always comment on everything that people were saying. And a lot of people showed up with fear and insecurity to speak out and to share their messy, you know, insecure, constantly evolving process. And you just
Mm-hmm.
had this what felt like an intuition, because it was so fast and felt so genuine, to just help make people feel safe and comfortable and welcome in their entirety of the experience that they were bringing to the project. And I was
Oh,
really
thank
struck by
you.
that. Yeah. And so in my mind, I'm like, I have to get to know this person. I don't, the podcast thing came up later, but I just felt like there's some really deep and rich magic that is happening in this woman's space and energy field. And I want to know the story, and I want to be friends with her, and I want to figure out, like, how can I support what I felt that you were bringing to the space, to the artistic community, which was just deep love and encouragement and connection. And I thought that
Mm,
that was just so potent and powerful.
thank you for seeing me. Goodness. Start the podcast off with getting the guest in tears. Nice work. No. I appreciate that. I really love people like so much. And being in the group has been so nice as like a tether for me. And
Yeah.
I just know how much it means for people to reflect back to me how I'm feeling. So I
Mhm.
know the power and the magic in that connection. Like that's what
Yeah.
heals us, is connection. So, and it comes pretty naturally to me. So I love
Mm.
being in spaces where I can just be like, "Hi, you're gorgeous. You're doing a great job."
Well, we love you in those spaces too. I can definitely
Thank you.
emphasize that. As we start, I would love to start from the very beginning, like
The very
little
beginning.
Molly, before the pink hair, before all of the self-doubt and noise started entering the channel. Because I'm
Mm-hmm.
of the belief that when we're born into this world, we have access to our full creative potential. It's
Absolutely.
it's our language, it's how we communicate, it's how we understand our environment. We don't have the systems and the structures yet, so it's just this
Mm-hmm.
pure sense of creativity.
Yeah.
So do you remember when you were very small, ideally before the age of maybe 6 or 7, how
Mm-hmm.
your relationship with your creativity was expressed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually, my first tactile memory that I have pretty viscerally is I think I was like 2 or 3 and probably in a pack and play and just like pressing my face up against the netting of the pack and play, just like trying to see everything. And I think that that's really where it started for me, is I was always a kid who was looking and observing and paying attention. Like my eyes were always wide open. And I think part of creativity, a big part of it is noticing. And so I was just noticing everything. I wanted to take everything in. I was a really sensitive kid, like full of feelings, but also full of enthusiasm and just loud. I had this blonde, like mop top afro, crazy, could not be tamed hair, and this is like, the late 80s, early 90s. So I loved bright colors. Like, all the 90s trends are coming back now. So it works really well for me because the neons are like on trend, and that's what little kid me loved.
Yeah.
Yep. I love me some bright colors. And so that started from the beginning. Actually, my dad always tells a story of when I was born, I came out with like my eyes wide open. Like
Oh,
I was just
wow.
looking around the first chance that I got. And so when I think about my connection to creativity as little Molly, like little Molly, there was just so much unfettered curiosity and wonder and enthusiasm. And it's really fantastic to talk about now because I'm 32 and I'm just in the last couple of years really tapping back into that life force energy. For a while there, I lost it, and that's a
Yeah.
big part of my story.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just wide eyes, big
Mm-hmm.
feelings, taking it all
Yeah.
in.
So
Yeah.
for those who are not familiar with your work or what you do, can you give us a little a brief synopsis of what your world like looks like these days so that we can bridge little baby Molly into where you're at now in a way that feels cohesive?
Yeah, absolutely. So my work these days is kind of two things primarily. So one part of it is me as the fine artist, right? Whatever that means. I paint and I'm really into mixed media now. And it's primarily, it has historically been abstract expressionism and what I call these shattered abstracts that I make, which is like layers of colorful paint, and then the last couple of layers are some pretty intense, full of care line works that make my pieces look a lot like stained glass. And almost like all of these broken pieces have come apart and then reformed in this emergent process to bring them back together. So that's kind of like my fine art side. And the other side is I am what I like to call an imagination doula. So I help people come home to themselves through creative practices so that they can birth the ideas that they want to bring into the world. So there are these two parts of the cycle for me, and they feed each other. Because if I didn't have my own creative artistic practice, I don't think I would be as well informed on, like the hero's journey that creatives go through, and vice versa. So any one day could look like either like podcasting or coaching people, teaching mindful doodling workshops, or I'm in my studio, painting, working, shipping out orders, things like that.
So let's pick back up into your story where we left off with little Molly being very observant and connected to her environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Visually and sensually. And I don't know if you identify as being a highly sensitive person, but I definitely am a HSP over here. Um,
Love it.
and it's definitely a gift and a curse to feel everything.
Yeah.
um
Yeah. And I identify as an Enneagram 4 and an ENFP. So there's so many feelings all the
oh
time.
yes. Indeed. So I would love to know, as you were exploring your world and starting to um come into yourself more as you become deeper and deeper embedded in your environment, did you grow up in an environment where your creativity was encouraged and supported and seen as, the epic thing that it is, or was the relationship around creativity a little bit more complex in your environment?
Yeah, so there's some very interesting tensions when I talk about like my upbringing because at home there was four of us. There was me and my younger sister and my parents. And my mom, I feel like I got all of my playfulness and wonder and joy from her. She is turning 70 this year and she still goes sledding on their hill and like she like there and my dad's playful too, but she's like the most playful person I've ever experienced. And I was homeschooled for a good chunk of my childhood. And so those years before fourth grade, when I was homeschooled, I was at home, I was like a free range child, basically, were really amazing because I was allowed to just create and play. And my parents always encouraged like the arts. My mom took me to see Peter Pan on Broadway when I was 4 as like our first date. And I remember watching Peter Pan fly, and I was just
Yeah.
like, this is magical. Like, I love this so much. And that was a hallmark of a lot of my growing up was this encouragement of creativity. But what's interesting is that another part of growing up in America in like a Puritan steeped like hustle culture where achievement is like king, and also growing up in a very conservative situation. So I grew up in an evangelistic like Christian church. And that was a big part of our life. We went to church every Sunday. I went to youth group. I like, so I was like steeped in that. And what started happening was all of the wonder and playfulness that I had and like exuberance for life started coming up against these barriers of like shoulds and what things look like, and adults in my life who didn't have the emotional literacy or resources to be able to
Mm,
make the expansive space for me. So I know
yeah.
that they wanted to, and there's this duality of like they did the best they could,
Yeah.
and also we all carry this developmental trauma, right? Because trauma is basically a rupture in your relationship with yourself.
Yeah.
And oftentimes as
Mm,
kids, we have to abandon our authenticity in order to maintain the attachment. That's just like how it works to
mm,
keep us safe.
yeah.
And that happened for me in a lot of little ways until it got to a point where it was just like I had learned that from a lot of little micro things that I was just a little too much. My emotions weren't really tolerable. Um, and it was little things from like my dad not being able to handle just me in a given moment, or, starting to be in a school situation where I couldn't just roam free. And so it was just like, yeah, like the box just kind of kept closing in little by little.
Yeah.
And growing up in Christianity, it was more like, I always joke that I was tense until 28. Like I just was so tense because I was always like, I have to check every action I make against the Bible, against my pastors, against like, it was basically outsourcing my power and my
Yeah.
agency,
Yeah.
to the point where I had kind of lost track of what agency felt like. I never really truly had it in the first place. So maybe when I was, first born, but it slowly got chiseled away. And now I'm in a place where I'm reclaiming that. But yeah, that pretty much brings us up to, like high school. I was an emo kid. I was always in the art room. So I was always creating, but there was always this tension of like almost two parts of me that
Yeah.
felt like difficult to integrate.
Hmm.
Like I was in churches that were also very affirming of creativity, but not affirming of other things. And so like I've only just discovered my queerness in the last couple of years, which like
Mm,
if there are parts of you that you have to smush down, that automatically dampens the rest of you. It's like
yeah.
Brene Brown says, you can't numb just one thing. You have to numb all of it or none of it. And so
Yeah.
that tension, that anxiety just started building walls around my creativity till it got to the point where it was like, I don't really know. I
Hmm.
didn't feel that in touch with
Yeah.
myself.
The last piece you said about your queerness, I find that so interesting also, because the way that I've been speaking about this journey is, if you fundamentally deny something that is fundamentally a part of who you are, whether that is your creative energy, whether that's your sexuality, whether that's, fill in the blank, as you push it down, you create this pressure that
Yeah.
starts to fracture you. And
Mm-hmm.
then when the big event comes, the big loss, that a lot of
Yeah.
times it's a separation from loved ones, so breakup, or a parent dies, or you leave a community, oftentimes it can be your health, or it can be a job, something that
Yeah.
you have placed your identity in, that when that
Mm-hmm.
goes away, you don't know who you are anymore. And
Yeah.
because you have already fractured, you shatter when that happens.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
it's so interesting that there is a journey and a pattern that is revealing itself in a way that, like the hero's journey or the heroine's journey, it's there and it's present, but you don't
Mm-hmm.
know until you learn about that. Yeah, it's just so interesting how this manifests differently for different people based on their unique situation, but there is
Mm-hmm.
that universality to it that
Mm-hmm.
we don't know is universal until we have time and space to have these types of conversations.
Yeah, and I love how you said like we don't really realize what has happened until, like hindsight is 2020. We have like all these things we go through. And so I didn't realize like I wouldn't have described myself during these past times as being like unhappy or any, like I've always been pretty joyful. But it's interesting looking at pictures of me from like 10 years ago now and seeing like this sadness in my eyes. Like it's so striking to me. I'm like, I just didn't know that I wasn't tapped into my life force. Like I didn't know what that felt like. And I love that you brought up the cracks because, and like the big, there has to be like a big something, usually like a big sad. So for me, that happened in 2014. It was like the big crack, one of the big cracks. And I actually lost a friend, a close friend, very tragically. And he's my age and he had kids and like it didn't make any sense to me. And so one of the things that I put all my identity in was being a Christian. And when this thing happened, I got all of the same lines, even that I had said to other people of just like, like God has a plan and there's a purpose to this. And in that moment, I was like, this doesn't really feel like a good plan. Like this feels like this feels like something else. This just feels like the chaos of the universe. This doesn't feel like something that was planned out by like a divine whatever. And so the cracks in my faith started coming.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until like 6 years later that everything really like shattered.
Yeah.
And I had
How
that big
how
moment.
old were you at that point that it first started cracking?
Oh man, math. 2014.
Give me an age range, like
I
early
was like 20,
20s.
yeah, mid 20s,
Okay.
24,
Mm-hmm.
25. Yeah, because my
Okay.
daughter was almost 2. It's
Mm.
actually on her second birthday that it happened. So we had to like leave
Oh,
and go. And yeah, it was
wow.
wild. And so another part of my journey is that I got married really early. I got married at 21 because I was another should, It's like,
Yeah.
when you're in the church, one of the things is like it's you can't have sex until you get married. And so
Yes.
like
Yeah.
bringing in the sexuality again, it was like, you know, you're horny kids, just get married. That'll work out. Like and so I was really young. We got engaged when I was 19. So,
Wow.
right.
Did
So,
did you
yeah.
feel like you were in love? Or did
Yeah,
it feel
of
okay?
course.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't have any, like you're young, so you that definitely was like my first big love, and it was real, and I was best friends with this guy. Um, but you're also so young that you don't really know yourself yet. And, we live many, many lives and we evolve constantly. And so we're not going to be the same person that we were here over here. So when we got married, I was one person, and then 10 years later, I was a very different person. So we got married young. We were both in school. And then we had 2 kids while married, while doing full-time ministry, while in school, like just moving at a nonstop pace. And I see that now as like, oh, we were just like so used to going fast and just like repressing things and not really like taking into account what was happening. It
Mm,
was all these shoulds, right?
yeah.
And so in 2014, when that tragic loss happened, that was the first time that I was forced to slow down. Like, because it was like, and there was nothing that I could do about it. Like, it was
Yeah.
very out of my control, but it was the first thing out of my control that also didn't feel like it was in quote unquote God's control. And so I was like, well, if it's not in my control and it's not in this thing's control, who's in control?
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
it was like that ego shattering moment of like, oh no.
Yeah. Yeah. I call it the spin, and it
Yeah.
feels like you lose true north. You
Hmm.
don't know where north is anymore.
Yeah.
And that is panicky and scary, and you have no sense of how long it's going to last, or is this the new normal, and like cue
Yeah.
all of the feels.
Yeah. Well, and what was wild was that at that point, my husband and I were both in full-time ministry. We were like worship leaders. So music, basically like picture the rock stars of the church. That was basically like who we were. But we were expected to perform, you know, quote unquote. It's not called performance. It's called leading worship, but it's basically performance. So, and after a couple months of like after this loss, the pressure was coming in to like not be such a downer on stage. And that was actually when I started being more interested in emotional literacy and things like that, because I was like, oh, the space that I'm in is not prepared for like deep grief. We don't like, the leadership doesn't understand grief and how it works, and how human emotion works. And so that ended up being a journey and a process that brought me to 2016, when everything really intense politically was happening in the United States. And there was more cracks happening in my marriage because I realized that I was in a very different place than my ex-husband was, in all of the ways. And then in 2017, I ended up leaving my marriage, leaving the
Wow.
church. So that was like the big bubble
Wow.
burst moment
No
of
kidding.
like, I got to a point where the cracks were so intense that it was like, I can't sustain this. Um, I can either try to stay, and I probably won't survive, because I was actually like suicidal. I was so depressed at that point. Like, it had just gotten to such a fever pitch of pressure. I was like, either I stay and I won't survive, or I go and nobody understands, but at least I will survive. And
Wow.
so it was like, I just have to go. And the fallout from that was ridiculous. Like, I
Oh,
lost my whole community. I had a big realization of what relationship and conditional versus unconditional love actually was, because I thought I had unconditional love. And then when I left that community, it was very clear that it was conditional. And so, talk about like losing your identity again. It was just like, oh, all these things that I was convinced of most of my life are actually not true. So, what do I do with that? I guess I'll just go with these broken pieces and figure it out.
I've had friends who have left those environments, and I've had friends that have stayed. And both
Hmm.
of, I mean, either option is really complex and identity
Yeah,
shaking, because
it
when you've
is.
grown up with such a clear sense of what is real and what is right,
Hmm.
to then discover that, oh, wait a minute, the world is mostly gray. Wait a minute, a lot of this
Yeah,
depends on your perspective. Oh, wait a minute. And sort of that
yeah.
unraveling. How did you how did you get to a place where you could make the decision, I'm going to take these broken pieces and step out into the unknown, and I feel like that's a better option than trying to reconfigure myself back into the should box?
It's a really interesting question. And I appreciate it, because I think a lot of people assume that it's like a choice that we make. Like, people who deconstruct from Christianity are just like, oh, I just made this choice and I'm gonna go. I didn't want to. I I had this visceral feeling of being like, oh no, oh no, oh no, like it's breaking. Like, I felt it breaking for however long it was that it was breaking. And that was panic inducing, because, like you mentioned, the certainty and Christianity and the community around it was so nourishing for me for such a long time, until it wasn't. And then when it wasn't, it was heartbreaking. And like, there's a lot of grief around that that I've had to process through. And yeah, it wasn't something I wanted. It wasn't like I just picked one day to go. It was just like, oh, this is dead for me. Like, I need to leave.
Mhm.
Shit. Like,
Yeah.
I gotta go. And so for me, I had this moment of, I actually wrote a couple of poems about it, but I like to use the metaphor of like Alice in Wonderland, in the moment when she eats the little treat and she is growing and her arms and legs like pop out of the house.
Yeah.
And it's like, I always see it as like a painful experience, because it's like, a house is a place where you're supposed to be so cozy and safe, and like when your limbs are popping out of it, it's got to be like cutting on windows, and like, there's like a lot of pain happening. And it was kind of a moment of like, I popped out of the house and I looked around and I was like, oh, I guess I need to leave. um And for me, like I mentioned before, with my marriage too, it wasn't like something that I wanted. I worked my butt off for years to try to keep that marriage together. And it finally was this moment of like, you got to let this go. It's not gonna work. And it's not working for him either. And it seems like you have to be the brave one and leave and like free both of you from this toxic relationship, even though nobody is going to understand. And like almost nobody did understand. Even my parents, our relationship is repaired for the most part now, but like I was effectively homeless for about a year because they didn't want me to come home. They were like, if you don't have the kids with you or, A, B, C, and D, you can't come home.
More of the conditions.
Yeah, more of the conditions. So, which we have since, talked about and worked through. But
Mhm.
yeah, that was 2017 was the moment for me, the moment
Yeah.
that lasted a year.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
And I'm sure
Yeah,
has residue all the way into the present and
for
potentially
sure.
even the future.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how did you get from that place of being so distraught and so
Hmm.
disconnected and so
Hmm.
unsure about who, like, what were the pillars that were holding you? What was your scaffolding? How did you get to
Yeah.
the point where you rebuilt yourself? And I'm curious about whether or not, or maybe how, your
Hmm.
creative self and your artistic self helped facilitate that process, if at all.
Oh, yeah, it absolutely did. So I really, going back to like the loss of my friend, I started painting again at that point. I actually had a master's degree in education, speaking of shoulds. So
Yeah.
I like, went through college, did all the college classes and like did the safe quote unquote job.
Yeah.
So I started painting again at that point because I was like, oh, life can end at any time. Am I doing what I want to do? And then fast forward to 2017 when this like cataclysmic event happened, and I left everything. I honestly was just depressed for a while. Like
Yeah.
I couldn't really move. I just had to feel the grief, and sometimes you just have to be in it.
Oh, yeah.
Like the cave experience in the hero's journey, you just have to be in the dark night of the soul and really feel the texture of the walls. Um, and really, one of the biggest scaffolding things for me was my creativity because I've slowly, like bit by bit, started feeling the walls and painting them and and being like, well, this is the thing that got me through the grief when I lost my friend.
Yeah.
And this grief feels harder, but it's still grief. So maybe if I start doodling and painting and not make it be anything, it'll just be a tether for me. And so I describe my art and my creativity as that like tether to hope. I feel like that has been the thing that I've just, pulled on, like you're in the cave and you find a string or a rope and you just like follow it through the cave. That's been my art for me. And it's emerged and evolved with me as I've gone through that process. And it has evolved to like show more and more visually the process.
Yeah.
But that for sure, my creativity was like, oh, I was this kid who just wanted to look at things and, touch them and make stuff. And so if I don't have anything else, let me try that. And that is truly the thing that like has pulled me through and has allowed me to be safe in relationship again too. It's like given me, because I've also needed community around me, and I've slowly but surely found people because we can't do it by ourselves. So it's definitely not just like me pulling myself up. It's me plus those couple people who were holding my arms up basically
Hmm.
too. Hmm.
Yeah. Can we go a little bit deeper into that? Because one of the
Yeah.
things that struck me so much was I felt like you were a master at community, like at holding space, at feeling the pulse, at
Yeah.
reaching out and making other people feel comfortable. Like at first I
Yeah.
thought, oh, maybe she's on staff, or maybe she's like working for this somehow, because it felt like you were an essential part of at least
Mm.
my experience. So
Mm-hmm.
going from a place where you were so embedded in community and that was so
Yeah.
much a part of your identity, and then the process of breaking or transitioning out of that, I
Mm-hmm.
imagine that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but when you think that someone is stable and then
Mm-hmm.
the shit hits the fan and it turns out that they bounce, at least for
Yeah.
me in my history of that, it it changed my relationship with trust.
Yeah.
And it became harder for me to trust people after I had more of those experiences. So,
Yeah.
in your process of repairing your relationship with the community that you had grown up in and rose even to the leadership of,
Yeah.
how did you then rebuild the trust that is necessary to even think about entering into another community and showing up vulnerably and really open to connect with others?
I missed it a lot. And something that I should say too is that through I part of my process of integration and like healing has been realizing that it's not binary. Like I can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like I can't just take the entire 30 years of my life experience and be like, this was all bad, because it
Yeah.
wasn't. Um, and a lot of my work in, excuse me, my marriage when we were in full-time ministry was community work. And so through that decade, I became masterful at being in community. And and then when the trauma of breaking with that happened, that ended up leading me to a deeper place, because then I understood by going through the experience of grief what, another layer of the human experience. So it was like, oh, now I understand XYZ, why these people left. Like I didn't get it before. Now I get it. Um, but also, to be really honest, there was a couple years, like I think 2017, 2018 in particular, I didn't really have very much of community, because it was one of those things where I was so hurt and so, like you said, just like broken, that I was just like missing it, but not really wanting to trust people. I went through a whole phase of like nihilism where I was just like, nothing means anything. And which is really funny now, because like I just am not a nihilistic person, but I had to go through that thing where I was just like,
Of
nothing means
course.
anything and nobody cares. And like,
Of course.
really thankful for the person that I am engaged to now.
Mm.
Ironically, his name is Christian, which I
Oh.
find endlessly hilarious. um, but he was a real like tether for me, and like a practice ground for me to find trust again, because he was such a safe space and such a juxtaposition from my first marriage relationship, where it was like, oh, this is what it feels like to not walk on eggshells. All right, I did not realize that I was walking on eggshells like tents this whole time. And
Yeah.
oh, this is what it means to like be held in safe space and not have any expectations on me. Like this is what it feels like. And then starting to get a taste of that, and be able to co-regulate in that, because that's so powerful. I was then able to integrate that into myself and my relationship with me. And I think really healing those ruptures in relationship with myself, and back to the authenticity that was lost when I was a little kid, bringing her back and like re-enveloping my inner child, and really like talking to her and being like, hey, like your caregivers and the other leadership and everything failed you all these times, but like I'm not going to. So it's been like such a layered experience of healing, and then seeking out community that's felt good. I definitely had a few tries with community that
Hmm.
didn't feel great.
Yeah.
And you find out like what you don't need
Hmm.
first, and then you're like, oh, this is actually what I do need. And so 2020, I found so much community. It is
Yeah.
wild how much community I found, like through Elle and her mandala practice. It's a whole other circle of community that I'm a part of, 100-Day Project, all of these things. And so, like, 2020 was really a year for me of cocooning and incubation and re stepping into that role, because it's scary to step back into emotional leadership, I guess we'll call it, because I had such a fear of hurting people. And even more than me getting hurt again, it was just like I was afraid to hurt people. So now I'm at a point where I'm like, you know what? I had a friend say to me, "Hey, you're not going to hurt anybody. Like, you are doing the work. It's safe. It's safe for you." And I just had to, process that. I cried, processed it, and realized, it's going to be messy. And that's what like leadership and community is about. And so it really was like this whole, like you've said, hero's journey of like losing it, and synthesis back to antithesis, thesis, all of these things like coming back together and being like, oh, these are all the things that I loved about being in church community.
Yeah.
And how might I be able to recreate that in a way that's not in a toxic religious setting? Like, let's take all the things that are really, really great about it. And I'm still trying to find that. I'm actually right now working on something called The Nest, which is going to be a 6-month program for creatives detaching from evangelicalism
Oh, wow.
and reclaiming their full selves. And so right now really is the moment where that is about to birth out, because I have this vision to create a safe container for people who have that shared language and shared experience, but who want to find their expansiveness in the world. So it's to put it all in a concise way, it's been a process.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
think so many of these experiences are universal. They almost feel like fractal experiences,
Yeah,
right?
it really is that process of Adrienne Marie Brown calls it emergence, which is like that big things, big systems, big movements are coming together of a multiplicity of small relationships.
Yeah.
Like, and it's really those one-to-one relationships that create these nets of
Hmm.
community and experience.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And I would say opportunity,
Yeah.
because that's so much of what is embedded in community, because you're connecting with
Mm-hmm.
other people around things that get you excited and get you fired up, and you're
Mm-hmm.
sharing, and that's the fertile soil in which new relationships, new collaborations, new projects can
Mm-hmm.
grow up out of.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, that feels like an important part to bring into the conversation, particularly
Mm-hmm.
right now, because I think a
Yeah.
lot of the creative recovery that people are seeking, that
Mm-hmm.
reconnection with themselves, is because they're feeling like they're in some strange configuration in a should box somewhere, and they know like there's got to be something better. I reached my hand out
Yeah.
of this box and I touched something, which let me know there's a whole other world out there, and I'm not really sure how to go from this into
Yeah.
the full kind of experience. So
Mm-hmm.
it seems like right now there's lots of different types of creative recovery programs that are connecting with audiences based on where they are.
Yeah. Well, and because I've had the experience of literally having relationships come back around with people that I mentored in the college ministry program who are now also deconstructing, who have seen me deconstruct and reconstruct, and who have reached out and been like, thank you for sharing about this. And me realizing, that they're on the same path, and this rising energy of me feeling like a mama bear for them, or like a mama
Yeah.
bird, which is why,
Yeah.
the nest. And I just wanna bring them in, because it's like I know the language. I went to seminary. I taught y'all when we were in it. Now let's just like take all the safety and like move it over here,
Yeah.
you know? So,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just such a privilege to be able to do what I'm doing. And I see it as like a miracle that I survived all of this and came through. That's pretty wild. Like, yeah, it's just there's so many things that need to happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some people spend their whole life in shoulds and then just like
Mm.
double down, double down, double down,
Yeah.
and end up just so numbed out that
Hmm.
it's really hard to reconnect with creativity. Like, so many people that I teach, there's so much nervousness even around like doodling on a page because we have
Yeah.
so many creative woundings.
Yeah.
So the more that I can do to help that, the more that you're doing to help that. Like we're literally making the world a better place by helping people connect with their imagination.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that the so much of the value in that, besides just the joy that you
Hmm.
feel, is that when you allow yourself to play with your imagination and you get good at playing with your imagination, not
Hmm.
because of any other reason than just practice and repetition,
Yeah.
you unlock potential and power.
Yeah, and a big part of my work is creating safe containers for people to meet themselves again, to like trust themselves,
Mm-hmm.
because that's a big part of my journey is
Yeah.
like not having agency, not thinking that I could trust myself. Because, like biblically, literally, my
Mm-hmm.
flesh, my body, not trustworthy.
Yeah.
And so, like, coming through that to being in a place where I was like, oh, what would happen if I did just trust myself? Let me just experiment with this for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And like the amazing floodgates opening of creativity to
Yeah.
that is just, it's literally reconnecting you with your life force or your chi or whatever you want to call it, energy.
Mm-hmm.
That's creativity is right in the center of that. So I love the privilege of being able to help people reclaim themselves and trust themselves again and really like connect to agency. I think
Yeah.
that's a big thing because so many of us feel like we don't have any power, and
Mm-hmm.
it's just not true. Like we
Yeah.
have this beautiful core creative battery with like unlimited power, and it's just helping people tap back in and coming home to that.
Mm-hmm.
Like you have it in you already. It's not out here somewhere. So let's just like slow down,
Yeah.
tap into that in the context of safe community.
So I would love to go into, now that you're in such a different place from where
Hmm.
you originally started and where you journeyed through,
Yeah.
how do you support yourself on a day-to-day basis to maintain that relationship and continue to build that trust and
Hmm.
to continue to fuel your art in a way that it evolves and it contributes back to you and to the larger community?
Yeah, so I have learned so much about myself in the process of going through this journey, and I've learned so much about my needs and how valid they are, and how I have learned through lots of trial and error what my leadership looks like when I'm not resourced and what it looks like when I have the resources that I need, like internally and externally. And so I know that I need time for play, for rest, and for work, like every day, because every human needs all three of those things, and those three things are all very different.
Yes.
So for me, I have like a pretty robust morning rituals thing that I do every day that's like 2 hours at least,
Wow.
sometimes more, that involves me checking in with myself, going slow. I have a self-care menu that I have created for myself because I know, like, the more that I've learned about me and how my personality works, the less structure, like, the less intense structure, the better. But I need like a skeleton. I need like handholds. And so I have this whole list of things like, are you drinking water? Like, what are your biological needs? These are all the things you need for your biological needs. These are all the things you need for your relational needs. These are all the things that you need, and it's not like a checklist, like it's exhausting. It's more like a menu, like, oh, I might feel gross because I need to lay down. And I might feel gross because I need to doodle for 10 minutes, or I need to move my body, or whatever. And I think for me, the game changer has been flipping the script from everyone else being important first to me being important first. And that's not selfish, that's self focused, like taking your oxygen first so that you can help change the world. And I can only help change the world if I'm breathing, right? So I take so much time for myself. Um, and it's really important. It's like the first most important thing. And then I take time for my closest relationships, my partner, my kiddos, all of that. And then I have everything that I need for, the community that I run, murmurations, for my clients, for all of this. And so it really has changed from everyone else is important and I need to like consider everyone's needs before my own, to my needs are actually the most important. I need to tend to my inner child, my inner panel of, there's a whole panel of them. And what is
The
everybody
council.
saying? Is a whole council. It's really interesting. I've started making reels on Instagram about it because it's just so funny. But yeah, I care for and I listen and I notice and I have lots of awareness practices to check in with myself that I've built. Um, yeah. And I just feel so nourished. It's ridiculous. Like when I
Mm.
think about myself a couple of years ago, even I'm like, I feel just 1,000 XP better because I'm taking care of myself first and I'm,
Yeah.
you know, being nice to my friend Molly,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. And I love the visual of that being a menu of self-care services.
Hmm. Yes.
I would love to ask you, now that you're in this place where it sounds like you have so much perspective and hindsight, and
Mhm.
that you've done like the deep, I call it excavation work,
Yeah.
where you're like, you are in there. It is messy. It is dirty. You feel gross, but you find things that have been buried underneath that when you
Mm-hmm.
bring them to the surface and you kind of dust them off, can tell a really important piece of your story.
Yeah.
So having gone through, and it sounds like you have the practices to support you and continuously going through that,
Mm-hmm.
do you have any words of wisdom that you would like to share with your younger self? And hopefully it's something that can be that you describe the rope in the cave, but
Yeah.
something that can be just like a tail you can grab onto and kind of follow it out. Is there anything
Yeah.
from that personal perspective that you would like to share with your younger self at any age?
Yeah. I definitely have very specific messages for specific ages, but the overarching, the deepest theme for me has been, hey, you can trust yourself. I know that all of these external voices are telling you you can't, and you feel like you have all these shoulds, but you can trust yourself. Just try it. See what happens. And it's actually really interesting when I'm saying that out loud because one of my practices is kind of a time travel practice where I imagine myself now like shouting back through the universe to my younger self. And that echo of that voice is actually what I heard in that moment as like the still small voice of my intuition. And same with like, I see myself from 50 years from now, like being like, hey, girl, it's okay. You're doing so great. Like, don't you worry about it. You can trust yourself. That's definitely the core message. And also to be curious and not judgmental of the things that are going on in here.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Oh, such
Hmm.
important wisdom. I'm
Yeah.
probably going to write that on Post-its and stick it around my studio.
Do it.
So in wrapping up here,
Hmm.
where can other people who are interested in your story or curious about what you're doing, where can they find you, connect with you, follow along? Where's the best place to
Yeah.
do that?
So I hang out on Instagram a lot, and I am the Darling Revolution on Instagram. My website is thedarlingrevolution.com, and you can get more. There are updates coming soon about the nest, and you can sign up for murmurations and all those things. And my podcast is called the Darling Revolution Podcast, and that's pretty much wherever podcasts are found. So,
Amazing.
yeah.
Amazing. Well, in final closing question, I want to offer a space for you to share anything that feels important to be said that I haven't asked you
Mm.
specifically, or anything that still feels like it wants to contribute.
I would just say, especially because we touched on community so much, and I know that it can feel really hard when you're isolated and really awkward to reach out, but just do it. Reach out. And if
Yeah.
you don't feel like you have anyone to reach out to, DM me on Instagram. Like, seriously.
Yeah. That's what I did. And
'Cause
that's how you ended up here.
there you go. People are nicer than you think they are.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
reach out.
Absolutely. I'll throw mine in there too. If anybody
Yes.
feels called to connect, I would love to receive any message too.
Yeah, we are here for it.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show and for showing up with such presence and wisdom and empathy for both yourself and your own experience, but also the community that you came from. I know a lot of times it can be difficult to hold space and have that much empathy when there's a lot of pain wrapped up in that
Mm-hmm.
experience also. So I just
Yeah.
want to acknowledge that because that's not lost on me.
Thank you. It's a process. And if you are listening and you're someone who's just like leaving religion, it's okay if you're really mad right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can DM me about that too, because it's not like an instant snap your fingers
Oh, no.
process to get to the point where you can forgive people. So
Yeah.
I get it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for
Beautiful.
seeing me and having me on your podcast. It's been really
Oh,
fun.
such a pleasure. Thank you, Molly. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the Art of Lost and Found podcast. I hope that you are feeling inspired and empowered to go forth and explore your curiosity and creativity. As always, if you want any more information about any of our guests or the show notes or anything we discussed on today's episode, you can head over to www.brookeeston.com/podcast. Thank you so much and looking forward to seeing you in the next episode.